Digging Up the Past with the Oregon Archaeological Society, with your host, Bonnie Mills. Bonnie's guests this evening are Dr. John Woodward and Wayne Jensen. The topic of tonight's show, prehistoric shipwrecks on the Oregon coast.
And as a special guest, Jim White.
Good evening. Welcome to Digging Up the Past. I'm Bonnie Mills, your host for tonight. Our subject for tonight's show is going to be something that's been in the news quite a bit all over the United States, and that's shipwrecks. Only we're going to talk about shipwrecks specifically on the Oregon coast and in general on our northwest coast. We have three guests this evening. The first is Dr. John Woodward from Mount Hood Community College, Wayne Jensen, Director of Tillamook County Museum, and Jim White, who's a consultant and a diver. So between the three of them, they can really enlighten us on what happened in the past on the Oregon coast as far as shipwrecks are concerned. So Dr. Woodward, I'd like to start with you, and can you kind of give us an overview of shipwrecks on the Oregon coast?
Well, of course, there are many historically documented shipwrecks right up to the present time. But what is particularly fascinating to archaeologists are the shipwrecks for which there is no documentation. Mm-hmm. And we have legends and we have archaeological evidence of shipwrecks occurring, European shipwrecks, possibly Asian watercraft, being wrecked on our shores during perhaps the 16th century, or conceivably even earlier. And of course we have no direct documentation of the names of these ships, and so the evidence that we have has to be obtained from other ways.
So what kind of archaeological evidence do we find?
Well, we in fact have some right on the table here that we could get right into this and discuss right now, if you'd like.
Okay. Wayne brought these in from Tillamook County Museum, so perhaps he could tell us what this big chunk of stuff is.
This is a piece of beeswax which is found on the Halem Spit. This is part of the cargo, we believe, of Manila galleon. The radiocarbon dating on another piece that's in the museum was 1500 to 1650. And most of them a lot of them had marks on it. This one you can see an N and a diamond over here on it.
So what do they think these marks are?
Shipper's marks, most likely.
Why would they be shipping beeswax? Was this a commodity that was worth a lot of money at the time?
It was. It was part of the cargo of the Manila galleons from Manila to Acapulco. The church used a lot of the beeswax. And
okay. So they were transporting it from the Orient to the New World. Okay.
I think, Wayne, some of the marks suggest Jesuit ownership as well. There's some religious symbols on it. It's quite interesting.
So that was shipping that early?
Oh, yes. Yes, the Jesuits were in Japan, for example. The Jesuits were in Latin America during that time period.
Oh, okay. And this is a smaller piece of the wax?
This is a smaller piece, yes. This is about what they find now. You'll see something like this on the beach. A lot of people pass it by thinking it's a rock. And you can see how it's turned white from the sun.
So at one time there was a lot of this found. Early 19th century, or early 20th century and the late 19th century. I mean, like tons and tons.
Right.
Yeah.
When the early, well, it started about the earliest records was Lewis and Clark mentioned it. And then the Tillamooks having brought beeswax up to trade, they brought it to Fort George at Astoria about 1813. And Also, there were supposed to have been 6 or 7 tons shipped to Hawaiian Islands somewhere around 1847. And then the early settlers in the Halem would go over and plow for it or dig it up, and then they would melt it down and sell it to Portland to a seed company out here.
But they actually found it in the sand.
Right.
If I can interrupt for a second, a piece
Sure.
was found by State Parks crew just this last year.
Big piece?
Oh, a piece about the size of the smaller of those
Oh,
two.
okay.
So it does occasionally turn up, and when people find it, it would be great if they would turn it into the state or bring it to Wayne's attention.
I know that OMSI has some in their collection too. So it's been around. People have
Yes.
been aware of it for quite a while.
And also they found candles, which we have some in the museum on exhibit.
Like,
Tapers, small ones, about, I suppose, half, 3/4 an inch, and then some others as large as 2 inches in diameter.
John, how do you know this came from the Orient?
Well, I think both Wayne and I could try and answer that, but there's pollen that has been identified as attributable to specifically the Philippines.
Right.
And we know historically that this is where the beeswax was mostly produced for the trade. As far as the radiocarbon date that Wayne mentioned, there's actually now 4 radiocarbon dates.
Yeah.
And recently Wayne brought to my attention that 2 dates that were done in 1961 and which had been published as 1670 AD. The original dating was 1530 and 1535. And they adjusted the dates to slide them closer to the present to make them more compatible with what they believed to be the shipwreck source, which is around 1700. And then the one that I mentioned, the most recent find, just this last year, has been dated at 1560. The one that we got was 1650, but it could be calibrated back a little further. So roughly, if you average out the 4 dates, they come close to 1570, 1575, you know, give or take. So certainly a late 16th century date for the beeswax is compatible with the 4 radiocarbon dates that we have. Much earlier than was previously thought.
That's interesting. You brought in some rocks too.
Yes, the rocks are from Neocani Mountain.
Oh.
Fabled treasure rocks of Neocani.
Let's talk about those legends of Neocani. Jim's laughing. It's the story of Oregon next to the Blue Bucket Mine. But supposedly there's vast treasure on Neocani Mountain, right?
That's what they claim.
Well, how did these rocks tie in?
Well, I should go back. The first rocks were found somewhere around 1870, early 1870s, by a fellow plowing up the beach. In fact, right close to where Dr. Woodward's building a house now. but these are the
There's no connection.
so-called treasure rocks in Neocani, and they sat down by the beach, and treasure hunters, you know, used those for years to go out and look. And I think about, I should say about 1968, another fellow I got interested in, we were watching them dig on treasure on the beach. And we decided we'd look around. So we went over and talked to a fellow that had found a rock as late as 1947. And this, he told me, it was found on a mound of stones. And this is where we kind of started gathering up a few rocks. We looked at it. It had 1632 carved on it in a triangle. And after a few trips there, we found out it was found on a mound of stones, 10 foot in diameter, 2 foot high. And it ended up that if you went 1,632 yards north, you came to the North Mound, which is 10 foot in diameter, 2 foot high. And along one side, fallen down a stone, which was 16, 17 inches long, but it had a groove up one side across the top and down the other side exactly 36 inches, which was a measurement. And this is rock here at the base here is one that was come from a triangulation point. It looks like, we call it the A rock, it looks like an A on one side, but it's basically where the lines came in to a point.
So they were using it for some kind of a survey?
This is what we've come up with. It is a survey.
So somebody's surveying to see maybe how tall the mountain is, and then we end up with a treasure story? Is that possible, John?
I don't know where the treasure comes in here. Wayne knows more about that. I don't think there is any treasure. I think it's lovely folklore.
Well, you know, the Indian legend was that there's a fellow named Pat Smith who dug for years. He's a pioneer, and he's supposed to marry an Indian woman, and she's supposed to have told him that the Indians watched the white men come up on the mountain, pack a chest up on the mountain, dig a hole, bury the chest. There was a black man who they killed. They put him on top of the chest and covered him over. Of course, this is interesting. This came out about, 1880 or something, about the time Kidnap came out.
Mm-hmm.
Treasure Island.
Yes. Sounds familiar.
But now we have some interesting archaeological evidence concerning a burial.
Oh, well, you're thinking of a burial at the mouth of the Salmon River.
With the person was buried face down on top of planks.
Well, that was not a Neoconi mountain. That was at the mouth of the Salmon River estuary.
How far away is that?
Oh, Wayne, how far?
50 miles.
50 miles. But what's interesting about that, there's several things interesting about that, is it kind of illustrates how folklore develops.
Right.
It was found in the 1970s, and the fellows that found some human remains eroding near Lincoln City reported their discovery to members of the press, and it was printed in the Oregonian and perhaps elsewhere as a man lashed to the deck of a ship. And I was in charge of the removal of the grave because it was eroding. It turned out to be in itself quite interesting, but we soon discovered that it was not anyone lashed to the deck of a ship, but was in fact a more or less normal grave that had been fashioned using cedar planks, probably obtained from an Indian habitation nearby. In itself, it was extraordinary, though, in the sense that the person had been buried face down, and quite likely had had their hands tied behind them. So that in itself is the stuff of folklore and legends. But the artifacts with the burial, plus studies of the bones, indicated that the person was not a Native American, could indeed have been a sailor or even a settler during the 1840s or 1850s. But it kind of illustrates how folklore can develop in the 1970s, because the results of our more scientific investigations were in fact never published.
So folklore has a lot to do with the shipwrecks on the Oregon coast.
Indeed it does, and I think with every retelling, perhaps even what I said tonight will be told and told and come back to us in 10 years. So I'll repeat it. We did not find anyone lashed to the deck of a ship. But before the mass media, of course, when stories were told from one person to the next, certainly you get distortions and elaborations, and it's often difficult to determine at what point a change has occurred or the motivation for making those changes in the telling. For a long time, archaeologists were a bit reluctant to become involved with northern Tillamook County because of the treasure stories and the folklore. But we now know that the folklore is one issue, but there is conclusive evidence of prehistoric shipwrecks there, and whether there's any treasure or not is a whole another issue. And the treasure to us is discovering the history of what happened there, not some probably imaginary gold bars, and I'm sure Wayne would concur with that. There's no archaeological evidence of anything of great value there other than the historical material.
Yeah. Jim, we're talking about legends. You're very familiar, having written a small little book about a legend on the Oregon coast that is involved with the shipwreck. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yes, I'd like to comment, though, John, that we did some diving there at the mouth of Salmon River, and we saw evidence of a commercial fishing boat, but not any evidence of a large craft in that area.
We don't know the origin of the burial. We don't know who the guy was. He was buried in an unusual way, and perhaps was an unusual person, but whether it came off a boat or whatever, we don't know. Probably never will.
Probably not.
Yeah.
Well, the story that I wrote is more speculation and perhaps folklore. It started with the discovery of a ballast pattern of European rock that in digging about a bit more, we found that there were reject bricks thrown in the original ballast also. With a great deal of difficulty, we finally got some reports back from England placing the bricks in the village of Walbottle, which is now part of Newcastle upon Tyne, in the 1790s. This would have been a small vessel. The ballasted area is only 30 feet long, so we'd have a maximum of 65 or 70 foot long. By speculation, one might speculate this was the time that Jack Ramsay, or Lamazee as he was recorded in history, arrived there. Looking at the journals of fur traders, we can speculate that at that time he would have been a cabin boy. So
Jack Ramsay or Jack Ramsay's father?
well, the Ramsay that Ross Cox and others talked about.
The actual young man.
Yes. Now, which one this was? I don't know. The stories are so mixed up, John. It's hard to speculate. So that's why I wrote it as a novel.
Well, you know, 60 feet is interesting because isn't that the length of the Golden Hind?
Yeah, about.
It is.
It's a small ship by our standards today. It's not very
65 was the length of the Brigantine Hope, which is one of the famous vessels in the fur trade during the 1790s, and I think the sloop Union was 70.
Well, Sir Francis Drake's.
120.
Was it 120?
It was.
Roughly.
Was it longer? Yeah.
Right.
So it could have carried quite a bit of
Yeah,
cargo.
the Lady Washington was around 59, 60 feet.
Well, with only the ballasted area obvious, you can be speculated. There's no wood remaining, so that we can really pinpoint the marine architecture from that.
You see, Jim, you have the advantage of being a writer, so you can say what you want. Archaeologists have to be
Well, I can
somewhat more
also
mundane
define
about
it as fiction, John, the more folklore.
So, but there was a European, Jack Ramsay, and possibly his
Yes.
son.
Well, Lamazee was first commented about by Lewis and Clark. They saw him. Later, there was considerably more comment about him by the people with the Northwest Fur Company after the incident in which he had become the interpreter on the Tonquin. But the Tonquin was gone. It went out in 1811, 1812. The Northwest Fur Company obtained the post at the mouth of the Columbia, and to the best of my knowledge, nothing was seen of Lamazee or Ramsay until about 1813, when Gabriel Francher, I don't know whether I pronounced that right, tracked him down up on the Washington
He
coast.
had Jack Ramsay tattooed on his arm.
Yes, right.
But probably some of the listeners are not familiar at all with this legend of Jack Ramsay. Maybe we should explain that he was a red-haired Indian, very lightly complected, and seemed to be more European in terms of his habits and his understanding of English. And certainly stories have tried to explain who he was as perhaps a survivor of a shipwreck. And I think he was indeed, or the son of a survivor of a shipwreck about 1790 or 1780.
Well, I've questioned whether he would be the son of a survivor because of the genetic traits. The red hair, fair skin.
I know there's
traits.
an argument to that effect. I'm not convinced of that argument. If he were English, certainly he wouldn't have had difficulty communicating with Lewis and Clark. I'm troubled by that. But
Yes.
the second generation, where his father had died relatively young in his life, being brought up by the Nehalem or the Clatsop, probably wouldn't have remembered much English. Lewis and Clark described him as being about 30, about 25, around in there, which would mean that he would have been born probably 1785 or 90, or somewhere in that time period. Yeah.
So have you been able to date any of those bricks to a real conclusive date?
The opinion expressed by Basil Safer, the curator of the Museum of Ancient Brick in Johnson City, Tennessee, was they were not much before 1800. In other words, 1790s.
Could they have
And-
been after that, Jim? Could they have been 1850s or something?
Well, John, you know, there's always some place that keeps using old techniques, so there's
Yeah.
a possibility.
Or even
And-
the reuse.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
The opinion is based upon the rectangular part of a brick that's set down in to hold the mortar better, referred to as the frog, apparently came in close to 1800. And these bricks, the frog was made with a hand tool. You can see the handle mark in a corner. And
Yeah.
this was
Yeah.
the basis of the opinion. Also, the markings on the bricks were obviously inscribed in. The clay had curled back from the marking.
Sand on one side, probably, that they were washed with sand or placed on sand.
Well, no, these were down in the ballast, hadn't been washed by sand.
Well, when they were manufactured, very
Oh,
often you get
it could
this-
be,
yeah,
yes.
yeah. Well, you know, I think this is useful to talk about this because the viewers can get an idea of what we talk about when we try and date wrecks and the kinds of roles that artifacts have in attributing boats to their origin and their period. You know.
And the problems.
Yeah,
that
and the
can come,
problems and,
the-
the questions that...
Yeah, the speculation.
Oh, yes. Well, the speculation on the size of the vessel in the Halem Bay. All we have is the ballast area, and the ballast area doesn't come to a point. It's blunted off. They didn't carry the ballast clear up into the point, either in the forepeak or back toward the rudder. So here we have a 30-foot long area, a ballasted area, and we don't really know how much longer would have gone up into the peak. Whether this was, and some marine architecture in those days was very rounded off. So it could be smaller than 65 or 70 feet even. We don't really know.
Wayne, what do you think? What do you think about that ballast pile? I know you've...
Well, it's
You have-
definitely,
yeah.
definitely early shipwreck. But it's, you never know. It's just like the so-called beeswax ship that was supposed to be on the end of the spit, and all the pioneers were pulled planks off of it, teak wood or Asian wood.
Oh,
Nobody bothered to document it. We have a cane made from the wood
and it
in the
is,
museum. We're having it dated now, and but it is Asian wood. But they didn't pay attention. It's just like the beeswax. They didn't save it. They were too busy. The early settlers too busy making a living,
yeah, yeah.
and they weren't worrying about these things.
You're aware that some of it was donated also to the Columbia River Maritime Museum.
Yeah.
Oh, they
There's a
have
table up
some on
there that,
display, yeah. They have a table made from
from the
some timbers, from some wreck, someplace.
That's an Asian.
Oh, yeah.
There was. We're also going to be doing a carbon dating of a piece of fragments from a block that was found 1895 from the wreck.
A block of wood.
Pulley.
Rigging
Oh, a
block.
rigging pulley.
A rigging
Oh,
block
okay.
attack.
Yeah.
Okay, that brings up a good question. Jim, metal doesn't last under water, especially seawater, right?
Right.
So, you're saying you didn't find any wood and you didn't find any metal. All you find under there is rock. Do you have other evidence from other shipwrecks? Any wood or iron or copper or?
Well, not too much in the ferrous metals, Bonnie. Now, marine bronzes do last much longer. Copper sheathing goes. Copper sheathing on the Warhawk, which went down in 1885, is totally gone now. But the sheathing nails are there, and that is enough to run through metallurgical tests and determine the trace elements. When we were searching for the Tonquin here a few years ago with the Canadians, I came back with metal samples from 3 different wrecks, and you may recall Harvey Steele's comments with regard to that. These were the oldest wrecks. We're looking for a wreck that would have been 1811, and lo and behold, it's compatible with the trace elements in marine bronze Anglo-American 1920s.
So
That's when I kidded the Canadians they really didn't have any old wrecks up there.
you were looking for the Tonquin up in the Queen Charlotte's?
No,
No.
that was near Tofino and Clayoquot Sound. We also went into Cayucot Sound, and
That
they
was
have
it.
since looked at Newidi and a number of other locations.
Perhaps you should tell our viewers the story of the Tonquin. why it isn't located. You know.
Well, the Tonquin also figures in with this character Lamazee.
Yeah, right.
The Tonquin is the vessel that brought the party with the Pacific Fur Company, Astor's original fur trading company, came out to the Oregon Territory to build a trading post at the mouth of the Columbia. Part of them came by land and part of them came by sea. The ones that came by sea came on the ship, the Tonquin, commanded by Captain Thorne, who was really a naval officer on loan. They landed the party at the mouth of the Columbia to start building the fur trading post. Then they picked up Lamazee as an interpreter and went north, never to be seen again. Lamazee later, when caught up with and questioned, said that the Indians seized the ship and perhaps dying crew member touched off the gunpowder and blew it up. He placed it in Clayoquot Sound near present-day Tofino out in Templar Channel, and that story has so persisted that there's a Tonquin Island in Templar Channel and Thorn Reef named after Captain Thorne. But in very sophisticated equipment up there, we found no trace either around Thorn Reef or Tonquin Island.
Here again we have an illustration of the problems with folklore.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there's really no way of knowing where she is.
Not really, no. All that we really know is they were supposed to meet up with a group of Russian fur traders and trade gunpowder for furs, and they did not make that contact. So somewhere between their leaving the Oregon coast, the mouth of Columbia, and I believe April 1811, wasn't it, Wayne?
There,
And the time that they were supposed to meet up north, the ship was lost, and no survivors ever came back, unless we count Lamazee, who wound up back living with the Indians.
Well, it's interesting that he's the only one that came back.
It is.
Well, he didn't really come back. He never came back down close to the people at Astoria. He stayed away from there.
Yeah.
Lived out the rest of his days up on the Washington coast.
We have a silver piece here, Wayne, that you brought in from the museum. Perhaps you could tell us about that one.
I would say this is the only piece of treasure that I know of that's been found on Nehalem Beach area. This is, I believe, is a holy oil container. It has O on there for oleum, for oil, and it has, it's broken off here. Apparently it had a cross on it at one time. Now this was found in the remains of a shipwreck down the end of the Spit in 1898.
This is the same shipwreck that they were taking boards off of?
We don't know.
Oh, okay.
They said they dug out beeswax out of the hull, though, and at the same time. And this was came to light around 1961 when it was sent to the museum, or in fact they wrote a letter telling them about having it in their safety deposit box. And they sent it to the museum at that time, and they photographed it and sent it back to the people. And I tried to find it several times, so last fall we finally found out where it was and managed to obtain it for the museum. They had, let's see, 1941, I believe, it was sent to Smithsonian, and they dated it as Dutch. And York made as a town of manufacture around 1750. The fellow had done more, one of the fellows done more research on it, and they come up that it was 16th century. So we're still working on it. We sent a letter to Holland and come back, wonder how come we thought it was Dutch. So, you know, the markings must not have anything to do with the town. We have some letters out. John has talked to Reed Colleen. We're doing a spec analysis of the thing later. We're trying to get the composition of early Dutch and early Spanish. Interesting thing about this, you know, going back to the legends, the St. Augustine, which was wrecked November 30th, 1595. They believe wrecked at Point Reyes, California. And she wrecked after they were surveying harbors. It was part of their mission. And she wrecked in a southeast storm. And the only one of the person, as far as I know, that was killed was a priest, a Franciscan friar that was a father that was on board. And they stacked a cargo of beeswax on shore, chests of silk, and also there was a fellow that was dug in Indian graves. He wrote a story that in, I think around early 1890s, that he dug up this, he said a burial, and there was a stone crucifix in it, and another cross of stone, and a 16th century Spanish coin. Of course, that could have been the priest.
Yeah.
And also, that could have been the cargo of the St. Augustine. This is the only place on the northwest coast, you know, tons of beeswax have been found.
So was she Spanish?
Spanish, yes.
How about, well, the Portuguese were running around at this time too, all up and down our coast, isn't that true?
Well, the Portuguese weren't really running up and down our coast. The Portuguese were trading in Asia very extensively, and were operating out of the
Japan, weren't they?
Japan
Yeah.
primarily, because they were the last European nation to be excluded. So there was probably also some sub-rosa trading with Japan, with the Christian community of Japan, which was closely tied to the Portuguese Jesuits, into the 1630s and 1640s. So at one point I thought that the beeswax wreck could in fact be a Portuguese boat. I'm not so sure about that now.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, looking at the radiocarbon dating again, I think the San Augustine is a possibility. Although there was a San Juaneno, which was a Manila galleon wrecked in 1578, or disappeared in 1578, so it could be another candidate for it.
Also, San Antonio, right after 1600,
Yeah,
disappeared
that's a
too.
little bit later.
Right.
Some of the ceramic evidence found around Netarts indicates late 16th century.
Let's talk about that ceramic evidence. That we haven't brought that up yet. There's even been projectile points fashioned from ceramics, and they're oriental,
Those have come from Tillamook County.
from Netarts specifically, I think.
They've come from a couple places in Tillamook County, and an interesting aspect of the shipwreck business is what were the impacts that survivors or even the materials that arrived on the wrecks had on the native people. And some of the effects are quite clear to us. For example, on one of the house pits that we excavated in Tillamook County, we only excavated half of the surface area of the house pit, and we found 50 fragments of iron. Most of these were just bits of rust with total oxidation. But we found no copper, we found no glass beads. So certainly and obviously there was a great influx of new materials, the beeswax, the ceramics which were made into small tools, projectile points, and most importantly iron. So you really had people going from a sense the Stone Age into the Iron Age as a result of these wrecks. And archaeologically we can document that.
Do you find any evidence that they were using the beeswax at all?
Oh yes, we found beeswax, in fact a fragment from the same house pit that had the 50 fragments of iron. What they were using it for is conjectural, but certainly the Indians did perceive it as useful in one or another way.
You suppose they could have been just taking it, keeping it because it was something different?
Oh, perhaps. The pieces that we've seen have evidence of wear. Perhaps they were using it to cook with, or to use for lighting. Perhaps they were using it to unrope or twine. But if you consider that there were possible survivors, then the survivors themselves possibly were communicating to the Indians European, or perhaps if they were Japanese or Chinese, Asian customs and ways of doing things. So this is, if this is true, of course, it from the view of anthropology, it causes us to take a whole new look at Northwest Coast culture in terms of what possible input came from Asia or even Portuguese or Spanish sources.
Also, that puts it in an earlier date as far as contact goes.
Yes. It's not entirely out of the question that you had wrecks from Asia before Columbus on the coast.
That's an interesting speculation. It brings up lots of interesting thoughts.
And perhaps even with survivors.
Question just went out of my mind. I'm sorry. I'll think of it in a minute.
Well, if the good one, it'll come back.
You're right.
I was going to come back to the marked stones up there on
Sure.
the mountain. I say we come to the conclusion it is a survey. And after working on it quite a while, I'd written to the Society of Civil Engineers and told them about it. And they sent the letter down to Oregon State University. And 1980, we had a fella come up to see me, and he'd done his master's thesis on surveying, on picking up the survey and putting it on rocks we'd found and doing a survey. Not to prove that we were right or anything, but to show him that he could survey and prove it. But he was the same conclusion, that it appears to be a 16th century English triangulation survey.
Now, Wayne, I remember a number of years ago, you were suggesting that it was Drake, actually.
Yes,
that
we
had
still
landed
feel
there.
that
You still feel that's true?
it's a possibility it was Francis Drake when he was
Well,
on the coast.
Certainly the beeswax would suggest that time period, but there's so much beeswax. How can you attribute that just to Drake? There was a second boat, I understand, that he
Right.
captured, a
Right.
Spanish boat.
They say that, Cermenio, I believe that's the way you pronounce it, was the captain of the St. Augustine. He got back. He said he was a place that Drake had been, and he was at a place where giant deer were, which are elk, and a few other things that he was talking about. An interesting thing the other day, he was at a bay with 4 rivers coming into it, which is Nehalem. At Drake's Bay, where they think he wrecked, there's only 3 rivers that go into the bay.
In fairness, we should add that there is conclusive evidence that Manila galleon of some
Right.
some nature did wreck at Drake's Bay.
And they claim Drake was there too. Of course, we don't say he wasn't in California.
Yeah.
He was at a bad bay in about 50 degrees. One narrative had stated.
Well, Wayne, would Drake have had enough room for all the beeswax that's turned up there?
No, it had come from the survey and the beeswax are from 2 different
You feel that's true? That
2 different
yeah.
wrecks. Yeah.
Well,
Or
certainly that's
I shouldn't
possible.
say Drake didn't wreck, but he
Yeah.
was there.
And I might add that there's evidence of perhaps even a 3rd or even a 4th wreck in the mid-17th century. Some of the ceramic evidence is pretty clearly around 1650, 1660.
Right, there was an early Chinese
So
junk, wasn't it, that
It-
wrecked
it-
at
it could
Cape
very well.
Flattery
It
around
was.
1830.
Yeah.
So they were.
So
so
we're not
multiple
talking-
wrecks is
yeah.
quite possible.
Is Tillamook Bay that treacherous? Or is it just winter storm?
Well, it'd be Nehalem.
Or Nehalem?
They, for some reason, they seem to wreck there. The Glenneslin, in 1913 October, sailed into Neoconee Mountain under full sail in the afternoon, on a sunny afternoon.
Oh, really?
And that's a classic, showing we're under sail. But in, February that year of 1913, earlier, the Mimi, which is a 4-masted bark, came sailing in on the Nehalem Beach. It was sitting on the beach, and she was originally the Glen Clova, sister ship of the Glenneslin. And they tried to tow her back out to sea, took the ballast out, and she capsized in April, and I think there was about 18 drowned on it, all local people.
Well, was there any explanation for why they were sailing right into the beach?
Well, I think the Mimi's captain thought he was turned into the Columbia, and but she sailed right in, this big ship.
Interesting question. We have this terrible oil spill right now in Alaska, and people are asking the same kinds of questions. How could it happen? It can happen today.
Yeah, that's true, but
But as a last comment, in regard to your question, the northern beaches of Oregon have always been famous for debris, including glass floats. And I've actually seen shipwreck debris, in the last 10 years, from
Especially World War II,
things that have washed in.
that's true.
So
We have
it's
the
kind
current
it's
that
kind of a
comes around.
dumping ground, and so disabled boats are very likely, or pieces of disabled boats or debris is likely to be thrown up anywhere along the north coast. So it may not be just boats sailing onto the beach, but the beeswax, for example, will float more or less, and could have been carried along. It could have been dumped.
That would be an interesting prospect to follow.
Yeah, I think the latest sailing ship was 1916, the schooner Oakland, that sailed in on the Halem Spit and ended up there, and they refloated her, took her across the spit. But undoubtedly, there's more, that we do not know of.
Let's talk about the Columbia Bar for a few minutes. I mean, this is talking about dangerous areas. This is noted worldwide for being a very dangerous thing to cross. Jim, perhaps you can tell us, are there evidences of older shipwrecks in the bar? On the bar?
The oldest recorded was 1829. That was the William and Ann. That was Hudson's Bay supply ship that wrecked on Clatsop Spit with the loss of all hands. The next year, Hudson's Bay was having bad luck, and their ship, the Isabella, came in and ran into a shoal in an area that's now south of Sand Island. The William and Ann hasn't really turned up. The Isabella was revealed when the channel changed here a couple of years ago, and Darrell Hughes, commercial fisherman, hung his net on some wreckage. And that has proven an interesting study.
You were able to dive on that, am I correct?
Yes, and initially we dove it, and that is probably the best preserved, oldest wreck on the West Coast, and the National Park Service people incidentally agreed with me after looking at it. It's thrilling, Bonnie, in that the first time when we went down, you could swim along the side of the ship, and there'd be these rectangular ports. You just kind of envision cannons sticking out of them. Now, the next year, after we studied the architecture, we found out there weren't cannon ports at all, there were ventilation ports. Of course, there's how your folklore comes about again.
You know, Jim has raised another issue, and that is the problem of preserving wrecks like this and protecting them from reckless people that envision treasure and relics to sell. And it is a real problem.
Yes.
Well, maybe I should say quickly that the Isabella contained nothing, because Hudson's Bay Company, according to their records, salvaged everything of value, including the rigging off of the ship. What is down there is an excellent example of 1826 marine architecture. It was built as a coal ship, that's why the ventilation ports. It's a snow, which is a type of brig. But yes, John, and not only that, now that the sand has moved off of it, it certainly is going to deteriorate because of the marine borers. We'll lose it in a few years if we don't do something with it.
I know a lot of us in professional archaeology are real concerned about preserving these shipwrecks. And, recently I've been hearing about people that want to explore the Oregon coast for treasure, and it's become quite controversial right down in your neck of the woods in Tillamook County. How do you feel about that?
Well, I feel that it belongs to the people. You know, I don't personally. I do not look at porcelain and that as being treasure. I look at it. I feel that they're artifacts.
And when they're removed, it is true of any archaeological site. When it's removed and taken out of context, there's no story there. We can't tell what it is, or why it's there, or who put it there.
It would be tragic if the identity of the beeswax ship is possibly known. The wreck may be there off Neoconi Mountain, and some folks came in and spoiled it in the pursuit of a few $1,000s. And
it could be broken in two. You know, part of it would have landed on the beach. Like I say, when this silver piece, it's an artifact. I mean, it might be one of the earliest pieces from contact, you know, that's on the, at least on the county.
But with the museum having it, being able to trace its origin, is telling us a lot about the shipwreck.
Well, I commend Wayne for taking it out, in this case, of the private sector and putting it in the public sector so we can all enjoy it and study it, because there was a chance that it would fall in private hands and never be seen again. And many items from Caribbean wrecks have had that fate, unfortunately. Large collections have been made, and archaeologists have only seen a few of the items. And we all lose when that happens.
Yes. The recent passage of the Shipwreck Bill has helped to protect these shipwrecks off our coast. So the Oregon coast is covered by that Shipwreck Bill, and I think that the people should know that these are protected sites with that passage of that bill.
All sites on public lands are owned by the public.
You don't think of the water being public lands, but it is covered.
Indeed
Yeah.
it is, yes.
The bone, John.
Oh, yeah. Well,
I've been wondering when you get to that.
I brought the bone. This came from an archaeological site in Tillamook County. It's the bone from a stellar sea lion that was killed by someone, perhaps a couple hundred years ago, perhaps a little longer. We excavated this very deep down in a what's called a midden, or a pile of debris from where Indians had lived. But what makes it kind of unusual are two things. First, it wasn't treated the way that we find most mammal bones in American Indian garbage piles. It wasn't broken up to get the marrow. Instead, we have some cuts here that are very narrow and are almost certainly the result of a knife, or perhaps a steel knife, iron knife, or a cleaver coming down a transverse angle. This kind of butchering technique you'd expect to find more in Asia or perhaps even in Europe. So this, number one, indicates a possibility of iron tools, almost certainly an iron knife or a cleaver. And secondly, it suggests the tantalizing possibility that we have a survivor of a shipwreck that was actually doing the butchering, and doing the butchering according to his traditions. And this then was discarded without being broken open for the marrow, as would be the typical American Indian fashion. And then the archaeologist comes along, takes the dirt off the top, and finds this, and we have a little bit of evidence, perhaps, of these mysterious events that we're trying to explain scientifically.
So what's the difference between a mark an iron knife would make and a stone knife?
Well, the narrowness of these scratches is quite interesting. You see, there's one there, there's one there, there's one there, there's several there, and there's one going in the other direction here. Now this resembles to me many bones, cow bones, other bones, sheep bones that I've excavated from known historic sites where the butchering was being done with a cleaver or a knife by a person in the European tradition, or in some cases the Chinese butchering tradition. Hacking it in this fashion, more typically an Indian person of centuries ago would use a hammer stone and fracture this open, remove the meat in a somewhat different fashion. So the evidence, although there's just a few scratches here, certainly suggests that something is different about this than most of the other bones that we found at the site. So perhaps Jack Ramsey's father
I was just wondering about that.
had seal for dinner, and we have the evidence of that, perhaps.
So have you
Don't find any
found,
red hair on it.
would you be able to do any trace analysis?
I don't think so, no. Not after, in regard to the metal that was used.
Yeah.
I don't think so, because if the knife had been left there in contact with that, certainly. In fact, at the same level that we found that, we did find iron.
You did.
We did find iron. So it's very probable that iron was used, but what is, to me, even more interesting is the evidence that the butchering technique is not Native American.
Yeah. Was there a radiocarbon date at that level?
Not specifically from that site, but it was in association with material that is 17th century,
Sure.
probably. Yeah.
So again, it's pre-Lewis and Clark.
Pre-Lewis and Clark, there were no trade beads at that level. There was no copper, no trade brass, but there was a good deal of iron, and it was near the house pit, which also had some beeswax in it.
That's very interesting. When we talked on the phone last night, you were telling me that you're finding iron earlier than you're finding copper.
Oh, definitely, yes.
And that
In Tillamook County.
in Tillamook County.
Yeah. Now, the iron is being derived almost certainly, as we see it, from shipwrecks European shipwrecks would have had a lot of iron, and we find a lot of iron. We found nails, which still can be identified by shape, and we find numerous fragments of which were from unidentified items, which the Indians would rework and reshape, cold working. Or perhaps the survivors as well as the Indians, cold working these into projectile points. The copper comes in, 1700s with the opening of the fur trade itself, and it occurs at the same time that you have buttons, glass beads, and things like that. Prior to that, you have some ceramics, you have beeswax, and you have iron.
The thing about the copper is that this is sheet copper that's specifically for trade. It's
Yes, it
not.
is. Yes, it is.
It's not copper
No,
that's
it's not.
coming off the keels.
There is a theory that some may have had that origin, but metallurgically it has not yet been shown that that's the source of it. The source of the copper beads and things that have been analyzed appears to be intentionally trade copper that came in sheets or kettles that were cut up and reworked.
How about native copper?
To my knowledge, that hasn't turned up in Oregon at all.
Great.
Some may turn up in British Columbia. Of course, it does occur in the Great Lakes area.
Yeah.
And prehistoric trade certainly could have carried it across, but we haven't seen it in Oregon. Or to my knowledge, even in Washington.
No, northwest, further north.
Yeah.
Mm.
The
British
copper,
Columbia.
the copper that we see is all a part of the fur trade after 1780 up through the 1850s.
I think the arrowheads were looked like they were cut with a chisel,
Yeah.
cut out to trade. We also had some copper bracelets, and that come from different sites too.
The site that item came from, the bone came from, was about 3 feet deep, and the copper occurred right within the upper 6 inches or so, and the iron occurred all the way down to the bottom. So that and other sites clearly indicate the iron was there. Knowledge of metalworking developed, I think, in conjunction with iron, and later was applied to the other exotics that came in, the other metals that came in.
There's one other legend in Oregon and Southwest Washington about a shipwreck survivor, and I've heard the legend, and I've heard it really shot down, I guess one might say, and that's the story of Shoto. You want to talk? Do you know enough to talk about that? I'm sorry to do that to you, but I just thought
I bet
about
Jim
it.
knows more about that legend than I do. You want to tackle that one, or maybe Wayne knows more about it?
Shoto.
Shoto,
The Shoto clays.
a possible
No,
Spanish
I-
shipwreck survivor that was encountered in the Dalles
Right, that
region.
style of.
If we're talking about a Spanish or Portuguese shipwreck in 1570, and we're talking about a person alive in 1800, people don't live that long.
Yeah, right.
So,
Especially at that time.
especially at that
Well-
time. So indeed, there may have been such an individual, and he may be a survivor from a shipwreck, but it is a much later period than we've been talking about.
And supposedly he brought the technique of ceramics into the
Or
lower clay.
iron metallurgy.
Ceramics. The Shoto clays.
The Shoto
Oh,
clay.
the Shoto clays.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but again, that's in the realm of legend, and it
there's-
can't be proven.
There's evidence that the ancestors of the Chinook-speaking people had some ceramic knowledge as long as 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, right.
And,
Well, there's Canopies money too. You know,
The,
the Chinese
Chinese coins, yeah.
That's supposedly from a Chinese, from a junk that had wrecked up on Clatsop.
You know,
And those have been found in sites.
oh yes, yes, they were used as ornaments by many of the Native American people. You know, there's a problem here too in trying to attribute a lot of the achievements of Native Americans to outsiders, and and that's why I think it's important to remember that in regard to ceramics, you brought up that the American Indians had developed a ceramic tradition in this area going back at least 2,000 years.
Yeah, there's the theory that these are primitive people, therefore they can't
no.
do what we can do.
Well,
And I
there's
think that's something
examples,
needs-
their basketry, like
Yes.
the Tillamook, you know, they could copy almost anything
Exceptional
and
basketry.
do it in basketry. Covered bottles, almost anything, or see
yeah.
something and make it.
So on one hand, we need to speculate about what possible technologies were introduced. On the other hand, we don't want to deny the very significant achievements of the Native Americans too.
So what we really need to look at is things like this, where the technology is different, but not necessarily advanced.
In regard to the butchering.
Butchering,
Yeah.
uh-huh.
Oh yeah. A matter of fact, not using the marrow may be a step backwards, because
Yeah, that's
I
true.
think marrow is great. Very
Wasteful.
nutritious, and the
Yeah.
Native Americans, of course, knew that.
Well, we only have about a minute left, so does anyone have one final comment they would like to make? Wayne?
No, we just keep working at it. You know,
I think we're all
You know,
fascinated by this topic in overlapping ways.
anything's possible. You know, it's all theory now. You know what's happened and that.
We're trying to use science as much as we can and answer some of the questions.
I might throw out that some of the more recent developments in remote sensing electronic equipment may be of great assistance in the
Yes.
future of locating perhaps the remains of that Manila galleon.
It would be really nice if we could find it.
And if you'll find it for us, we'd love it.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, let us all know. We'll come and help. Well, I'd like to thank all three of you for
Thank
being
you.
on the program tonight. We really enjoyed it. Seems like the hour just whizzed by. I only have one book recommendation with me tonight, and that's Chinese Porcelains from Tillamook County site, which is a University of Oregon anthropological paper which can be obtained from the University of Oregon. If you're interested in archaeology in the Northwest, and particularly in Oregon, we invite you to join the Oregon Archaeological Society the first Tuesday of each month at OMSI at 7 o'clock for our monthly meetings. Or you can contact us at 656-8448, and that's an Oregon number. We also have Post Office Box 13293, Portland, Oregon 97213. Thank you for joining us for our program tonight on the shipwrecks of the Northwest Coast. Good night.